My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 34 years old. And the strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely feels like humiliation when it first arrives. At first, it feels like a normal day. A good day, even. The kind of day you think you'll remember for all the right reasons. It was late June, the kind of warm afternoon where the air feels heavy but comfortable, and everything smells faintly like charcoal and cut grass. I was standing in our backyard, flipping burgers over the grill, watching the smoke curl up into the sky like nothing in the world could touch me. For a moment, I remember thinking, this is it. This is the life I built. Daniel Hayes, my boyfriend of 9 years, was inside, moving between the kitchen and the patio, greeting guests with that effortless charm that had always made people gravitate toward him. This party was his idea. A celebration. He'd just been promoted to senior account manager at his marketing firm downtown, and he wanted to mark the occasion with something intimate but meaningful. About 20 people showed up, mostly his coworkers. A few of mine. My older sister Hannah had come early to help me prep. She'd been beside me all morning, slicing vegetables, arranging platters, quietly asking if I needed anything, the way she always did when she sensed I was carrying more than I admitted. And I had been. I just didn't know why yet. Daniel looked different that day. Not in a way I could explain. Just brighter. Too bright. He was wearing a button-down shirt I'd never seen before, sleeves rolled up just enough to look intentional, laughing a little louder than usual, touching people's shoulders when he spoke like he needed to be felt. At the time, I told myself it was just the promotion. Of course he was excited. Of course he was glowing. I didn't question it. That was my first mistake. I stood at the grill, turning burgers, listening to conversations blend together into a soft hum behind me. Ryan, my business partner, was there with his wife, Olivia. They were arguing playfully about something trivial, the kind of easy, familiar tension that comes from years of being on the same side. I remember watching them for a second and thinking, that's what we look like to other people. Stable, solid, unshakable. Megan arrived around 2 in the afternoon, Daniel's best friend. The kind of woman who walked into a room like it owed her attention. She was already tipsy when she got there, which wasn't unusual. Megan had always worn her lack of filter like a badge of honor, calling it honesty when it was really just recklessness wrapped in confidence. She grabbed a drink before even saying hello, then another, and then she made her way straight toward me. My name is I smelled the alcohol before she even spoke. Smells good, she said, leaning a little too close, her voice thick, her balance just slightly off. I smiled politely, keeping my eyes on the grill. Give it a few more minutes. She didn't move, just stood there, watching me. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite place, like she knew a punchline I hadn't heard yet. And then she said her name, not mine, another one. Has he told you about Vanessa yet? And then she said his name, not Daniel, another one. Has he told you about Vanessa yet? The word hit me like a pause in the air. I looked up, blinking. Who? Megan laughed. Sharp, quick, almost bitter. You're kidding. I felt something shift inside my chest. A small, quiet tightening. What are you talking about? I asked. Sip. She took a long sip of her drink, glanced around like she was checking who was close enough to hear, and then she said it, loud enough that the conversations behind us started to fade. When are you finally going to leave him, Natalie? It didn't even register as a question. It felt like an accusation, like I had missed something obvious. I could feel it happening around me, the silence spreading. Ryan turning his head, Hannah going still mid-sentence, people nearby pretending not to listen, but not speaking either. I kept my grip on the tongs, though I didn't remember tightening it. What are you talking about? I asked again, slower this time. Megan tilted her head, studying me. And for a second, just a second, she looked confused. Then something else, something like realization. Wait, she said, quieter now. You don't know? A sound escaped somewhere behind me, a small gasp. And I didn't need to turn to know who had just stepped outside. I felt it, the shift, the attention. Daniel. I turned. He was standing just outside the back door, holding a tray of burger buns. And the moment his eyes landed on Megan, the tray slipped. It hit the ground with a sharp, hollow crack, buns scattering across the deck, the ceramic plate shattering into pieces. No one moved. I looked at him, really looked this time, and whatever I saw on his face, it told me everything Megan hadn't finished saying. Still, I asked, because some part of me needed to hear it. Is it true? Daniel walked toward me slowly, hands raised slightly like he was approaching something fragile. Natalie, we should talk inside. I shook my head. No, my voice didn't break. That surprised me. We can talk right here. I glanced around at the people standing in our backyard. Apparently everyone else already knows. His jaw tightened. Megan had no right. She didn't answer the question, I cut in. Silence again. Heavy. Watching. Waiting. Is it true? I repeated. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw it. Not guilt. Not even shame. Calculation. Then he looked down, and that was enough. How long? I asked. He hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than anything he could have said. 8 months, he finally muttered. 8 months. 8 months of shared dinners, of quiet nights, of me planning our future, of him standing in this exact backyard, telling people how lucky he was. 8 months, of lies. Somewhere beside me, Hannah's hand touched my arm. Soft, careful, like I might shatter. But I didn't. I looked around, at the faces, the coworkers, the friends, the people who had laughed, eaten, and stood in my home, knowing. And something inside me didn't break. It hardened. Did you love her? I asked. He didn't answer. That was an answer too. And then Megan, because she couldn't stop, added one more thing. He's been talking to a lawyer, she said, quieter now, about splitting assets. That was the moment everything became clear. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a plan. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened a contact I hadn't expected to need that day. Karen Whitmore, attorney. My thumb hovered for half a second. Then I typed, I need to see you, urgent. Daniel noticed. What are you doing? I looked up at him, really looked. And for the first time in 9 years, and I felt nothing. You have until tonight, I said calmly, to pack your things and leave. Natalie? No, I said. And this time there was something sharp in my voice. Something final. You don't get to plan my life behind my back and then ask for a conversation. Someone near the front of the house called his name. A car had pulled up. I didn't need to be told who it was. Vanessa. Of course she came. Daniel moved instinctively toward the side of the house, but I stepped forward, blocking him. Not aggressively. Not loudly. Just enough. Not here, I said. For a moment we stood there, facing each other, strangers in a life we had built together. Then I turned, walked past everyone, through the house, upstairs. I packed a bag. Not everything. Just enough. Because the truth was, I wasn't running away. I was repositioning. When I walked back out, no one stopped me. No one spoke. And as I stepped into my car, I realized something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. It wasn't the cheating that broke me. It was the fact that I had been the last person to know. And I would never let that happen to me again. I drove until the house disappeared from my mirrors, checked into a hotel near the highway, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally, in the quiet, I let the silence settle. 9 years. Gone. Not in a fight. Not in a storm. But in a single sentence, spoken by the wrong person at exactly the right time. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, beneath the hollow ache in my chest, something else was forming. Not grief. Strategy. I barely slept that night. Not because I was crying. That part would have made more sense. Crying would have meant the pain had somewhere to go. But what I felt wasn't grief in any simple form. It was something colder than that. Something sharper. My mind kept circling the same details over and over, not like memories, but like evidence. The business trip in March, Daniel said, had been mandatory. The sudden gym membership. The way he started turning his phone face down on the table. The late-night client dinners. The slight change in his tone whenever I asked simple questions, as if I were inconveniencing him by noticing my own life. I had explained all of it away at the time. That was the humiliating part. Not that he had lied, but that I had worked so hard to make his lies make sense. At around 6 in the morning, I turned my phone back on. It lit up instantly. 43 text messages from Daniel. Some were apologies. Some were long, desperate paragraphs. Some were defensive. A few were angry. The progression alone told me everything. He had started the night terrified, then remorseful, then frustrated that I wasn't answering, then finally irritated that he no longer controlled the conversation. Hannah had texted 12 times asking if I was okay. Ryan sent one message. I'm with you, whatever you need. I looked at Daniel's name on the screen for a long moment. Then I muted the thread without opening a single message. From now on, I didn't need his explanations. I needed facts. At exactly 8:02 Monday morning, I called Karen Whitmore's office. Karen had helped me years ago when I formalized my event planning company. She was precise, ruthless when necessary, and blessedly unimpressed by emotion used as a substitute for strategy. Her assistant found room for me at 8:30. By 8:27, I was sitting across from her in a glass-walled office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, trying to explain how a backyard promotion party had turned into the public autopsy of my relationship. Karen didn't interrupt. She took notes while I spoke, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she folded her hands and asked, "Do you have any proof beyond the confrontation?" I let out a dry laugh. 20 witnesses heard him fail to deny it. "That helps," she said, "but I'm asking whether he left a trail." That question landed differently, because Daniel was careless emotionally, but not practically. He liked options. He liked appearing polished. Men like that usually believe their charm counted as a security system. I told Karen what Megan had said, that Daniel had apparently been consulting an attorney, that there had been talk of assets. Karen's eyes sharpened. "Then we move today," she said. "Not tomorrow. Not this week. Today." For the next 2 hours, she walked me through every account connected to my name, my business, my property, and our shared financial life. It was surreal how quickly heartbreak turned administrative. Savings, credit cards, business account access, joint subscriptions, insurance policies, property title. Every line item felt like a private wound translated into legal language. I told her about the house. I had bought it before Daniel and I were together, when it was still half-finished and ugly in a neighborhood people said would never appreciate. I had renovated most of it myself over 3 years, not because I had to, but because I love transforming things. I love structure, progress, before and after. The comfort of knowing effort could become visible. Then, 3 years into our relationship, after enough talks about forever and shared futures and trust, I had added Daniel's name to the title. At the time, it had felt romantic. Grown up. Right. Saying it aloud in Karen's office, it felt like confessing to my own burglary. Karen asked if I had documentation. And that, finally, was where my mind began to clear. Documentation was the one language I spoke fluently, even in shock. I had receipts for materials, invoices from suppliers, permit approvals, inspection records, photos from each stage of renovation, contracts from vendors I had occasionally hired for specialized electrical or structural work. My company required obsessive organization. Every project I ran lived in folders, backups, timelines, budgets. Karen actually smiled for the first time that morning. "That," she said, tapping her pen against her notebook, "may be what saves you." She started making calls while I sat there, feeling the strange steadiness that comes when panic finally finds a task. We flagged the joint savings for unusual withdrawals. We separated my business operating funds into accounts Daniel couldn't touch. We documented shared assets and current balances. Karen drafted a formal separation notice and told me we needed to prepare for the possibility that Daniel had already been planning to position himself as entitled to half of everything. Not because he built it, because he had access to it. There's a difference. And people like Daniel count on the courts not caring enough to notice. Karen asked whether I wanted to pursue mediation or prepare for litigation. I didn't even hesitate. Litigation. She nodded once, as if she had expected that answer. By the time I left her office, it was nearly noon. Outside, the city looked offensively normal. People crossing streets, baristas carrying coffee trays, delivery drivers unloading packages. No one knew that somewhere inside me, an entire life had already collapsed and reassembled into something colder. I drove to Hannah's apartment because I needed to be near someone who loved me before this turned into depositions and filings and timelines. She opened the door before I knocked a second time. The moment she saw my face, she pulled me into a hug so tight it almost cracked the numbness. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and dish soap. She sat me down, made coffee, and listened while I repeated everything Karen had said. Hannah was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she asked gently, "Are you sure you don't want to at least hear him out?" I stared into my coffee. It wasn't even the question that hurt. It was that part of me had once been the kind of woman who would have said yes, who would have wanted context, closure. A long conversation in a quiet room where the betrayer cried and spoke softly and explained how confused he had been. But confusion wasn't what had happened here. Planning had happened. Secrecy had happened. Calculation had happened. He didn't get caught because he developed a conscience, I said finally. He got caught because Megan was drunk. Hannah's mouth tightened. She nodded. And then very softly, "I know." I looked up. She held my gaze for half a beat too long. That was enough for me to understand she suspected more than she was saying. Maybe not specifics, maybe not proof, but enough. It stung. Not because Hannah had betrayed me. She hadn't. But because betrayal poisons even innocent silence. It makes you question everyone's timing, everyone's tone, everyone's hesitation. My phone rang while we were sitting there. Ryan, I answered because I knew he wouldn't call unless it mattered. You free? He asked. His voice was low, serious. I met him an hour later at a dim bar near his warehouse district, the kind of place that smelled like old wood and beer even in the middle of the day. He had already ordered me a drink by the time I sat down, though neither of us touched ours for the first few minutes. How bad is it? He asked. I gave him the short version. Karen, asset protection, separation papers, litigation. Ryan listened, then exhaled through his nose and said, Olivia knew something. Not everything. Not at first. But enough. One of Daniel's co-workers had mentioned him and a woman from the office a few weeks earlier at a work event, thinking Olivia already knew. She hadn't. She had spent the last month trying to decide whether to tell me, how to tell me, whether she needed proof first. I should have been furious. Instead, I just felt tired. Because that was the real damage of a betrayal like this. It wasn't confined to the relationship, it spread outward, into other marriages, other friendships, other people's judgment. Ryan apologized anyway. I shook my head. At least now I know. He nodded. Then he leaned back and said something that made me sit up. The woman Daniel's involved with? Her name's Vanessa. I stared at him. I hadn't heard her name yet. Until then, she had just been a shadow in the outline of my life. A faceless woman at an office. An abstract humiliation. Vanessa. A real person. Ryan continued. Olivia also heard Vanessa used to date him before he got together with you. On and off, messy history. Apparently she started working at the firm again 6 months ago. His ex-girlfriend. Of course. Of course the woman helping unravel my life was someone he had already left unfinished somewhere in the past. That detail changed the shape of the betrayal immediately. This wasn't some accidental workplace affair, built on proximity and bad judgment. This was history reopened, a door he had never really closed. Ryan took a sip of his beer. There's more, he said. Apparently, Vanessa had a reputation in the office too. Not for being reckless exactly, more for being the woman around whom Daniel became a different version of himself. Flatter. More performative. Like he was auditioning for a life he thought he deserved. And there was another detail. Vanessa had been in a long-term relationship herself until recently. So whatever story Daniel had sold himself about fate or chemistry or unfinished business, it was built on a pile of wreckage wider than mine alone. I sat there listening, while something ugly and clarifying settled into place. This wasn't romance. It was appetite. Ryan told me quietly that if I wanted, he and Olivia could ask around, discreetly, see who knew what, see whether anyone had information that might matter later. I nodded. Not because I wanted gossip, because I wanted a record. That night, back at the hotel, I found an email from Karen waiting in my inbox. The separation documents were ready. If all went smoothly, Daniel could be served by Wednesday. She had also secured an emergency hearing request to establish temporary protections on major shared assets and prevent either of us from selling, transferring, or borrowing against the house while proceedings were underway. Reading those sentences did something strange to me. They calmed me. Not because any of this was good, but because it was measurable. Legal language has edges, timelines, procedures. It doesn't ask you how betrayed you feel. It asks what can be proven. My phone buzzed. Another message from Daniel. This one was shorter than the others. We need to talk about the house and money. I stared at it. Not us. Not what he had done. Not the years. The house. Money. There it was. Not even hidden anymore. I set the phone face down on the bedside table and laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny. Because something inside me had finally clicked into focus. He wasn't panicking because he had lost me. He was panicking because he might lose access. And that distinction, that brutal, humiliating distinction, was the first thing that made me truly stop loving him. I emailed Karen back with a single sentence. From this point forward, all communication goes through counsel. Then I turned off the lamp, lay back against stiff hotel pillows, and stared at the dark ceiling. By then, the heartbreak had changed shape. It was no longer a woman asking herself how she missed the signs. It was a woman beginning to understand that some people do not betray you impulsively. Some people rehearse it. Some people build exits while kissing you goodnight. Some people smile across the dinner table while quietly measuring what they can take when they leave. And if that was the game Daniel had been playing for months, then he had made one catastrophic mistake. He assumed I would respond like someone broken. He had forgotten that I was someone who built things. And people who know how to build also know how to protect what's theirs. The first time I saw Vanessa's name written in a document, it didn't feel like jealousy. It felt like confirmation. Karen had warned me that discovery, the legal process of pulling records, messages, and financial activity, was where stories stopped being stories and started becoming timelines. And timelines don't care about feelings. They care about sequence, cause and effect, intent. By the end of the second week, we had enough material to begin mapping something that looked less like an affair and more like a strategy. Phone records came first. Months of calls and messages between Daniel and Vanessa. Not just late-night conversations, midday calls, work-hour exchanges, patterns that overlapped perfectly with the times he had told me he was in meetings or running errands. There was no ambiguity. There never had been. Only my willingness to accept incomplete explanations. Then came something worse. Calls to attorneys. 3 different firms. The earliest one dating back to February. Valentine's Day. I sat in Karen's office staring at that date while something cold slid into place inside my chest. On that night, Daniel had taken me to dinner, a small restaurant downtown with low lighting and overpriced wine. He had reached across the table, taken my hand, and told me he loved me. I remembered the exact way he smiled when he said it. And earlier that same day, he had called a divorce attorney. Karen didn't need to explain what that meant. Planning, not confusion, not emotional drift. Planning.
Right.
We found emails too, not romantic ones. Those he had been careful about. But legal emails. Structured. Neutral. Clinical. Daniel discussing asset division. Asking questions about property entitlements. Clarifying how business income might be evaluated. He had even created a spreadsheet. Karen printed it and slid it across the desk toward me. I remember the way the paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than ink. It was labeled simply, Assets Preliminary Overview. Line by line, it listed everything we owned. The house, my company, savings, furniture, even my equipment inventory. Each item had an estimated value beside it, percentages, projected outcomes. I didn't cry. Because in that moment, something became brutally clear. I had been living in a relationship. He had been managing an exit. Karen leaned back in her chair, studying my reaction. This helps us, she said. Helps.
Dang.
That word would have sounded cruel if it weren't true. Because in court, emotion is irrelevant. But intention matters. And this was intention documented. But Karen wasn't finished. There's another angle, she said, flipping through her notes. Vanessa. I looked up. Her history with Daniel may matter, Karen continued. If there's a pattern of behavior, it strengthens the argument that this wasn't incidental. A pattern. The word settled heavily, because patterns mean repetition. Repetition means predictability, and predictability means weakness. Karen had already reached out through professional channels. Vanessa's ex-boyfriend, Mark, was in the middle of his own separation from her. And unlike Daniel, Mark was willing to talk. We met him 2 days later. Not in an office, not in a courtroom, but in a quiet cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and rain-soaked pavement. Mark looked tired. Not dramatic, not angry, just worn down in a way that felt familiar. I'm guessing this isn't about business, he said after we sat down. Karen handled most of the conversation, but I watched him carefully, because I needed to know if the version of Vanessa in my life matched the version in his. It did. She's not reckless, Mark said slowly. She's intentional. That word again. She doesn't fall into things, he continued. She chooses them. And once she does, she commits. Doesn't matter who gets hurt. Karen asked about Daniel. Mark let out a humorless laugh. Daniel's her favorite kind of person, he said. Men who think they're in control. I felt something tighten in my chest. They dated years ago, Mark went on. Didn't end cleanly. They always circled each other. And when she got hired at his firm again, he shrugged. It was only a matter of time. Did she know about Natalie? Karen asked. Mark looked at me then. Really looked. And whatever he saw on my face made his expression soften slightly. She knew, he said. Of course she did. She also knew I existed, he added quietly. That part didn't surprise me either. Because people like that don't accidentally overlap lives. They layer them. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. I figured you might need this, he said, sliding it across the table. Inside were printed messages, screenshots, dates. Vanessa talking about Daniel, Not romantically, strategically. At one point, she had written, "He won't leave unless he thinks it's his idea." Another message, "I just need to be patient. He's already halfway out." I stared at the words until they blurred. Not because they hurt, but because they explained everything. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't passion. This wasn't two people losing control. This was two people aligning intentions. Karen closed the folder gently. "This is very useful," she said. Useful.
Okay.
That word again. On the drive back, I didn't speak. Karen didn't push. Because by then, she understood something about me. Us. I wasn't processing this as heartbreak anymore. I was processing it as information.
Night.
By the time we filed our updated documents, the narrative had shifted. This was no longer a case of a relationship ending badly. This was a case of calculated deception. Daniel's attorney, Monica, tried to push back, of course. Argued that consulting lawyers was within his rights. That relationships are complex. That timing doesn't necessarily indicate intent. But timelines don't lie. And neither do patterns. Our first hearing was scheduled for early August. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, in atmosphere. Daniel was already there when I walked in. For a second, just a second, I saw the man I used to love, the familiar posture, the way he adjusted his sleeve when he was nervous. Then he looked up, met my eyes, and I saw it again. Not regret. Calculation. He smiled. Small, measured, like we were still in some version of the same conversation. I didn't return it. Because whatever we had been was already over. What stood in front of me now was someone I understood for the first time. And understanding someone like that means you stop expecting them to feel anything you would. The hearing began. Monica painted him carefully. A committed partner, an equal contributor, someone who had invested time, energy, and emotional support into our shared life. It was almost impressive. If I hadn't known the truth. Then Karen stood. And everything changed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't dramatize, didn't attack. She simply presented. The phone records, the attorney calls, the spreadsheet, the messages. Each piece placed carefully, methodically. A timeline. February, March, April, May. A story told without emotion. And somehow, that made it devastating. Karen ended with a single question directed at Daniel. "Did you ever inform Ms. Carter that you were considering ending the relationship prior to initiating an affair?" Silence. Daniel shifted slightly. "No." One word. But it landed like a verdict. The judge didn't rule that day, but his expression, his tone, the way he asked follow-up questions, it was enough. We were no longer defending. We were winning. Outside the courtroom, Daniel tried to approach me. "Natalie." I didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't even look at him. Because there was nothing left to say. Not after everything had already been said. In documents, in timelines, in choices made long before I ever knew. That night, back at the hotel, I sat by the window, watching the city lights blur against the glass. And for the first time since the barbecue, I allowed myself to feel something that wasn't strategy. Not grief, not anger. Clarity. Because the truth was, this had never been about love. Not for him.
Why?
And once you understand that, you stop mourning the relationship. You start recognizing the escape. By the time the final hearing arrived in late September, I wasn't nervous.
No.
That surprised me, because this was supposed to be the moment that decided everything. The house, my company, the financial life I had spent years building. Early mornings, late nights, contracts, failures, rebuilding, growth. All of it condensed into a courtroom decision. And yet, I felt steady. Not because I trusted the system completely, but because I trusted the work we had done. The documentation, the timeline, the truth. Karen arrived 10 minutes early, as always, a folder tucked under her arm, her expression calm in a way that made everything feel manageable. "You're ready," she said simply. Not a question. A statement. And she was right. Daniel was already inside when we walked in. This time, Vanessa was there too. That was new. She sat a few rows behind him, dressed in something understated but intentional, her posture relaxed, like she belonged in the outcome she expected. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw it. Not guilt. Not even discomfort. Assessment. like she was measuring me against something only she understood. I looked away first, not because I couldn't hold her gaze, but because she didn't matter anymore.
Oh.
That realization came quietly, but once it did, it stayed. The hearing lasted almost 4 hours.
Peace.
Monica went first again. She leaned harder this time, more assertive, more insistent.
Bammy.
She argued that Daniel had contributed emotionally to the relationship, that he had supported me while I built my company, that shared life meant shared outcome. It sounded convincing, polished, until Karen stood. There was something different about her that day. Not aggressive, not louder, sharper. She didn't waste time dismantling the narrative. She simply replaced it, piece by piece. She revisited the timeline. February, the first attorney call,
Purchase.
the Valentine's dinner, the messages, the spreadsheet. Then she layered in the financial records. Proof of purchase for the house, years before Daniel entered my life. Receipts for renovations, permits, invoices, photographs documenting every stage of transformation.
Yeah.
Then my business. Contracts signed before I even knew Daniel. Growth charts, revenue timelines, client lists, everything. All of it tied back to one undeniable truth. I built my life, and Daniel had positioned himself inside it. Karen's final argument was simple. Contribution does not equal entitlement, she said, and intention matters. Then she sat down. The room felt different after that. Quieter. Heavier. The judge took his time reviewing everything, flipping through documents, asking a few final questions. And then he spoke. There's something surreal about hearing your life summarized by someone else, reduced to facts, evidence, legal language. But within that language, there was clarity. The house was awarded to me, based on pre-relationship ownership, documented personal investment, substantial renovation contributions. My company remained entirely mine, established prior to the relationship, operated independently. Daniel was granted a limited financial settlement, a calculated amount based only on his minor contributions to shared expenses over the years. Not half, not even close. $40,000. I didn't look at him when the number was read. I didn't need to, because I already knew what that meant. Everything he had planned, everything he had calculated, everything he thought he would walk away with, collapsed. Not because of emotion, because of evidence. Monica attempted to push back, lightly, carefully. But the judge didn't entertain it. The decision stood. Final. Daniel said my name once as we stepped out into the hallway. Natalie, please, just... I kept walking. Because whatever he thought this moment was, it wasn't a conversation. It was the end. Karen caught up to me near the exit. It'll take a few weeks for everything to process, she said. But legally, it's done. Done. Such a simple word. For something that had once felt impossible. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been that morning. A subtle shift. Season changing. I stood there for a moment, just breathing. And then something unexpected happened. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved in some dramatic, overwhelming way. I just felt light, like something heavy had finally been set down. 2 weeks later, I listed the house. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. I didn't want to live in a space that held that version of my life, the one where I had trusted blindly, the one where I had mistaken stability for truth. The house sold quickly. The neighborhood had grown more valuable over the years, and the work I had put into it paid off. After everything settled, I used part of the profit to expand my company, took on larger contracts, hired a small team, moved into a smaller place across town, something that was entirely mine. Hannah introduced me to her friend Michael in November. We went for coffee. Nothing serious, no expectations. And for the first time, I didn't try to read between the lines, didn't look for hidden meanings, didn't fill in silence with assumptions. I just listened, observed, took things slowly. Because trust, I had learned, is not something you give all at once. It's something you build, the same way I built everything else in my life. Piece by piece. I heard eventually that Daniel and Vanessa had moved in together. It didn't bother me. Because people like them don't build. They repeat. Megan texted me around Christmas, a long message, an apology. She said she knew she had blown up my life, that she hadn't meant for it to happen like that. I read it twice. Then I replied, "You didn't ruin anything. You revealed it." And that was the truth. Because the real damage had already been done long before that barbecue. All Megan did was make it visible. Looking back now, there's one thing I understand more clearly than anything else. Betrayal doesn't always destroy you. Sometimes it exposes what was already breaking. And if you're willing to face it, not emotionally, but clearly, strategically, honestly, it doesn't just end something. It frees you from it. I don't regret what happened. Not anymore. Because the woman I was before would have stayed, would have explained, would have forgiven. The woman I am now builds differently. And more importantly, she protects what she builds.